Okay, brilliant. So we're about 2 minutes past now. So a warm welcome to everyone today for this lunchtime webinar, which is on communicating effectively on the topics of ESG and sustainability. I'm delighted to welcome a host expert panelists on this, namely the kind of lead panelist, which is Alex Malouf. Just before we get started, there's a kind of few house rules. Obviously, we'll be kept on mute. I have uploaded this to our CIPR CPD ladder. So if you are a member of the CIPR, you can claim 5 CPD points for this for today. The session will also be recorded and sent round to all registrants. So if you do have to drop out or you've got some other commitments, not to worry, you won't miss out on any of the engaging discussions. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Alex. So all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to have a really interesting discussion today. We are very, very lucky to be joined by 3 remarkable panelists. I'm going to start with our person panelist on the left, Alastait Blair. Angus is the CEO of the Signet Institute. He is somebody who has extensive experience in terms of banking, based currently in the Middle East, but he's going to be moving very soon. So Angus, first of all, welcome to you. I also wanted to introduce as well Eleanor. She is the Senior Director for Corporate Sustainability, EMEA at Edelman. Previously, she worked in the UK government's COP26 unit, and anybody who follows sustainability knows how big of an event COP26 was. Last but definitely not least, Priya Sarma. Anybody who works sustainability, at least in the Middle East, knows Priya. She heads up sustainability and communications for Unilever in the Middle East and also the wider region. So as I said, an all-star group of people who are going to be talking through what is, in effect, going to be the biggest issue we're facing. Currently, I'm in the UK, got a heat wave. Everybody's talking about energy, issues around sustainability. So before we jump in, just one point, if you do have any questions, please do share them in the Q&A box. We are going to be asking questions at the end. Before we talk about communications, let's talk about the need for ESG/sustainability. Why does the issue matter to businesses? And along with that, what is the attitude of businesses and organizations towards the issue?
Did you want to throw that somewhere, Alex, or do you just want us to jump in?
Well, I was going to, Angus, if you heard me, we could address it to you because of the financial side and economic side. So what's your viewpoint on this? How much is this an issue to businesses? How seriously are they taking sustainability?
Well, can I put it in context, Alex, and the panelists? My background is investment banking, investment analysis in the city for a very long time, and asset management too. And historically, from the point of view of investors, it's always just been about the bottom line. But over time, that has changed. And I remember being in the city at Barings when the Cadbury report came out in '92, and subsequent reports have then added ESG. And now there's a very significant movement at last, of the last decade, into focusing by boards, particularly, but now obviously executive management, in terms of what ESG is. And there's, as you know, and we'll probably come to it, a debate about what it is. Well, it comes in various forms, and I think that I just want to set the scene because I want to, I think, come back to it, all of us, in terms of having metrics as to what it is. And I do want to split it up because if we actually look at the S part, the social part, it is important. But it's the E part, the environment, that I think is the vital part. And we see it, as Alex, you just mentioned, the heat waves we're having in Europe. What we've seen across the Middle East, where in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia in the northeast, and Iran and Iraq, we've seen temperatures above 50 degrees, and across the United States, wildfires. But what does it mean for companies? And it's on multiple levels, which I'm sure the colleagues will come to. But it's a part of now every board's risk scenario. It's part of their plans for how to make a sustainable business. It's making sure the business is sustainable for whoever is to come afterwards, but it's sustainable increasingly as to, is what we are doing affecting the eventual outcome and damaging the environment one way or another? And companies are having to increasingly focus on diminishing their impact on the environment. That could be in many different ways: emissions, the use of plastic, and so on, as well as the effect that having plants across the world would they be affected by climate change or floods or whatever. So it's now essential in most stock markets that companies have risk committees that look at ESG. Many companies increasingly having a sustainable officer or sustainability officer and a sustainability plan. I've just finished as the CIB Professor of Practice at the American University in Cairo's Business School. And CIB is one of the very few companies that I know based in the region which has a sustainability report. So it's imperative, increasingly important, a core part of board discussion and planning and on risk planning. And therefore it's important that all of us discuss it in whatever is right for each company to take forward its plans. Thanks.
Thank you, Angus. Eleanor, I want to build on that. You did a huge amount of work on COP26. COP26 essentially drove the agenda for much of sustainability the second half of last year. You could even argue over most of 2021. How important is the issue of sustainability to governments globally?
Thanks, Alex. First, it's lovely to be here, and I'm always sorry not to see audiences in person, but it's lovely knowing that there's so many logged in from around the world. The issue of sustainability is extraordinarily important and for governments. I think, though, I must correct you, actually. It wasn't actually on the agenda until much closer to the run-up to COP26, which was in November last year in Glasgow, as I'm sure most people know. But really, it was the release of an IPCC report in August that sort of underlined the state of urgency and the impact that we, as our sort of man-made activity is having on the environment, that really galvanized the global community. But I think, before that, I think it would be fair to say that we had felt like fairly disheartened in the COP unit, that we were pushing a big stone barrier up a boulder, up a hill, and not necessarily breaking through anywhere. So there was an enormous mobilization across, I think, developed world, more particularly following the release of that report in August. But I think really the sort of exciting thing that we saw too was a mobilization amongst the business community. And I think this last COP26, was really when the private sector really stepped up. Sustainability and climate is very important to governments, but I think governments, they're stuck in the same sort of short-term cycle, actually, that the businesses have been thus far too, in that, they have a horizon that is based on the election cycle. And it can be very difficult to make long-term plans that require massive cost and investment. So I think while there is a growing and increasing awareness of the need for action on climate, we're still perhaps not seeing as much of it as we need to.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Priya, I want to move over to you. I know you love me saying this. I'm ex-P&G, but Unilever has been very much a leader in the sustainability space, thanks to Paul Polman and his vision. Why did Unilever embark on this approach? Why does the issue matter so much to the company?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for having me here. Like Alex said, I have to say, Alex, we worked a lot. I know we are peer companies and very competitive, but we did a lot of work, I think, in the Middle East collectively. So, that's one of the, I think, the positive aspects, which is, collective partnerships that's coming about. But I think when Paul Pullman took over the reins of Unilever, and that was, I think, in about 2008, one of his key agendas was to ensure that companies like Unilever, which are at the front end of, we're one of the top FMCGs. We have such a wide category of brands that effectively means that our sustenance going into the future is really dependent across the value chain, both on the health of the planet and on the health of the consumers. We're an organization, we're a company, we're a business, and we are dependent on both ends of the value chain, right? We are dependent on getting access to a lot of raw materials and really good raw material. But if you have issues related to climate change and supply chains that we're seeing now, because of climate issues, then we can't be in the business that we're supposed to be in. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that climate action is going to increase poverty levels amongst consumers. So that effectively reduces their purchasing power. And as a business, if we don't look after the health of the planet, we are not going to be able to sustain ourselves really as a business. And I just want to throw out, a bit of the numbers in terms of the way we are currently as consumers, the way we are living. And there's been a steep rise in population, and more importantly, a lot of people are moving into urban environments, right? So manufacturing is effectively increasing. So, everything along with that, emissions, deforestation, everything is growing exponentially. And the challenges that are coming about with it are really, really rising. You have 1 in 10 people who are obese. And then you've got 1 billion plus people who are actually malnutritioned. You've got more than 1 billion people who are living in water scarce countries. Things that we take for granted is access to water. And, there's 1 billion people who don't have access to safe drinking water. And this problem is only going to increase. People don't have access to clean toilets. There's a big hygiene issue. We've just not even come out of COVID, but we've seen the importance of health and hygiene. So there are a number of growing problems, and as organizations, we've all got to step forward, take onus and responsibility, and try and ensure that these diminishing resources that we're using up very rapidly, we are taking accountability and we're trying to reduce waste and our footprint.
Thank you, Priya. Angus, I want to shift back to you in terms of the difference between sustainability and ESG. You touched on this before. Can you tell us a little bit more in terms of what investors are asking for when it comes to ESG, and how simple and complex can the concept be? Because there are so many different definitions in the marketplace of what ESG is.
Yeah, well, let me just quickly start on definitions. It's in train. I think COP, as Eleanor mentioned earlier, the fact that you've got increasing engagement at COP and other engagements with governments and regulators and with investors is that there's discussions around terminology, but in the end, it's about active change within companies. So I think in terms of definitions, I'd rather not get dragged into it. We know roughly what it is, or specifically what they are. But I think that I looked at one of Priya's tweets the other day in terms of repackaging of washing powder using no more plastic. That is an example of necessary change, where the company is making a change which is clear, and you can put that down to clear metrics as of cutting the use of plastic and so on. In terms of ESG, this is a greater issue. As I mentioned earlier, the background in the city and investment is that this focus on the bottom line will remain. In the end, shareholders want a return. It's what makes markets. Although I do think that over time, and I don't think it'll be long away, where we have to review certain businesses more directly so that they take greater account of what they're doing to the environment directly. And that will come up in COP, I'm sure, hopefully. But let me give you a case study I think that I found disturbing when I was amongst one of the topics I was teaching was corporate governance and ESG. And what happened while I was teaching in the term at AUC was that with the issue of Danone, where the company was making progress under its last CEO, in terms of trying to set targets, making sure that it was pleasing those investors that wanted specific metrics to say this company is making a change. And as a result, a number of hedge funds got together and removed the CEO. Now, there's going to be more of that, I'm certain, because hedge funds, private equity firms are very much looking in the short term and for their returns. And there's a battle going on very quietly in terms of how companies are coping with those stresses. And they can be significant pressures on both the boards and on the executive management in terms of pressures. You have investors increasingly, because it's coming from people like us and people on the street who want to be able to say their capital is being better invested for the future. And that's a very significantly growing part of assets under management. But there's still a very great degree of lack of engagement. You can look at perhaps Berkshire Hathaway in the United States for not wanting to get involved directly in the companies within which they have stakes. It's not a process or a position that I agree with. They have to be more active. I don't think there's a choice, frankly, from my perspective, anymore. So there's a battle between those who want to see change and those who are only focusing on the bottom line. And that calls for a bigger debate. Those who are putting money and their capital into funds. But I think the battle lines have already been drawn. You've got long-term institutional shareholders and hedge funds on the other side that I think that aren't buying it. You might have some hedge funds who are investing specifically, but they're not the majority. They're still a very small minority. So I think that all of us have to play a part in convincing institutions to change, to put pressure on their companies, because this is a long-term war. It's not short-term battles in terms of investors. So we need to have it happen in different ways. It might come from government setting new standards, and probably should. It might come from stock markets for listed companies to set new standards with goals, and it probably should. But it should also come from the bottom up in terms of insisting on change. And one final example I'll say, if those of you who remember the changes in the ozone layer in the past and chlorofluorocarbons, what changed the government time target? The government had set a target of 10 years of removal of chlorofluorocarbons. It was school children who bought into this concept through schooling, and they then urged their parents, and it happened within about a year, that the businesses responded to what became a very clear consumption change. So going back to your point about investors, as I've said, battle lines have drawn. It's not going to be easy. There are a lot of investors that want to keep it, especially in the US, on the bottom line, and I can understand that. But we have to effect further change, and probably more quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Angus. So Eleanor, let's shift to, yeah, go on.
Well, I just wanted to come in there actually, because I think that undoubtedly, I mean, that it's so interesting to hear your examples, Angus. But I think, there was a very interesting report that came out last year by Professor Partha Dasgupta, which looked at actually the economics of biodiversity. So I think I think that thus far we do tend to look at the bottom line as just monetary. But what we have absolutely failed to do as a society, or many societies, is to put an economic value on biodiversity. And I think once we actually realize that there is a cost extended to not just production, but sort of the end of life of whatever it is we produce or consume, I think that we may then see change very rapidly. And I think it is the model of change. It seems very, very, very slow, and then it can be very quick. And I think the hydrofluorocarbons is a very good example, but also, even societal changes that we've seen in the US or the UK that would have been inconceivable, 2 generations ago, happened very quickly and without, it seems, much upheaval. So I would like to remain a bit optimistic that, that these changes will happen, although undoubtedly there will be, difficulties.
Eleanor, I want to shift it a little bit. So you head up sustainability practice for a very large region, one of the biggest, if not the biggest PR agency in the world, I'm sure you get a lot of clients coming to you and saying, how do we communicate on this issue? Where do they start?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think you always have to start with the facts. And everybody in this room knows that, the perils of greenwashing and the level of scrutiny that has been applied to corporations and governments has increased massively in the last year, and it will continue to increase. So I think that you only communicate what you can honestly stand up and say is true. So if you're going to start with, you don't actually start with communications, you start with understanding where you are. So I think you have to audit your operations, your impact, your supply chain, and even, your outlets. So, what they call scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So what you produce, the use it goes to, and then the use that others make of your products. So I think that's where you really need to start. And then I think you figure out, what makes sense for us to actually be, what are we actually doing about this? And then you decide how to communicate it.
Priya, I'm curious as to the Unilever example, because you've been communicating as a company for decades. What does it mean to you as a company? And also as well, I want to look more internally. What does it mean to your employees? Because we don't often discuss sustainability from the perspective of internal communications.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so, I think one of the things like Eleanor mentioned is of course, you've got to first get into action and only communication thereafter. And we've as Unilever, we've been on that journey since 2010. So one of the key things I think also is communication with your key stakeholders on ambition and intention. That's always, I feel, a really good starting space, because once you put your ambition out there, you've got to find each and every means that you can to achieve those targets and ambition of yours. So that's one thing that we've been really good at doing, both at a global level and at a local level. So in MENA, we introduced a sustainable living plan only in about 2012. And that's when we started year on year. We ensured that we had an annual engagement with our key stakeholders. These were our customers, other partners, the government stakeholders, any partners that we were advocating with and engaging with to get our agenda moving forward. So engagement on intention and ambition is important, and thereafter ensuring that you are engaging on your progress as you move forward becomes very important. Additionally, I think one of the key learnings that we at Unilever have had is that it's very important to be transparent. And it's okay to say that we don't have all of the answers. Yeah, we may not be able to achieve everything that we have set out to achieve, but we are, putting in the effort, and we are making progress. And employees, of course, are a very key part of that, of the stakeholders that we have. And internally within Unilever, while we have, sustainability leads, however, our agenda is spread out throughout the organization. So our marketing teams all have to have a strong purpose behind their brands, and that's what they try and achieve. Our supply chain, so operational efficiency sits within our supply chain teams for manufacturing. So they're responsible for a lot of our operational sustainability and efficiencies. And in that way, we try and ensure that all teams are engaged and have a line of sight in terms of what we are trying to achieve at a local level.
Angus, I want to ask you about the measurement piece, because measurement is so important on this issue. What are you seeing in terms of measurements on the issue of sustainability, particularly in terms of how businesses report on sustainability?
We've touched on it, Eleanor and Priya, to a degree so far. First of all, it's to recognize, the board recognize what it's doing. You set a strategy, then you've got the plan, then you put it in action, and then after that, obviously, you can communicate the results. I just mentioned the example that Priya had tweeted. I think Twitter, by the way, is a great example of getting the message out. For me, at least, I think I don't use Facebook, but the example that Priya gave of the repackaging, of the removal of plastic, that is an identifiable metric. You can advertise that, you can communicate that, you can tell consumers you are now buying non-plastic washing powder, for example, if I remember that's what it was, and it's in paper. And therefore people will say, okay, as long as it's not too expensive, or it might even be cheaper, I don't know the pricing, people can then shift, and the demand curve for that product probably should move outwards, and that would be great. That is an identifiable metric. But you'd have to look, obviously, at the emissions from that and the repercussions of the use of wood and paper. And then can that also be recycled in itself? It's taking ownership, as Eleanor mentioned, the stages of the whole plan, from like stakeholders from over there to over here. And it's ensuring that you take ownership of that. You can, to a degree, bring all of that into metrics and the emissions. Is there transportation involved? You can now increasingly measure that more directly. And in terms of electricity and energy consumption, you can measure that. And the raw materials of the washing machine, that is, or the product, that is a metric you can measure. I think more and more companies, I think it's helped that if companies have a sustainability officer, and not every company does, especially new, young startup companies, but even mid-sized companies don't have a sustainability officer, or even someone in charge of it. I think increasingly, the moment a board or executive management decides someone is going to be the sustainability officer, the onus is on them then to produce the metrics. You can't just say, oh, we've got a plan, we intend to do this. They're not a politician. We need to have strategy and a plan and action and repercussions. So I think that it depends on the company. If you're a PR company, it's different. You've got emissions. If you're a Unilever, it's much more complex. And I think that then you need a team of people. I think that I can't answer it, Alex, very specifically because it varies from company to company. But in general, the moment you have somebody in charge, they will find the metrics and they will then report to the board, this is the result, and come with suggestions. You have to remember, this whole process isn't just up to the board. It's not just up to the executive management. It's up to everybody working the company and their clients and us as consumers, and making our voice heard. But the metrics, the moment you have somebody who's taking charge, then you begin to effect change within the organization and produce the metrics. Thanks.
Thank you, Angus. Now I'm going to open up to questions in a moment. I'll start asking questions to the audience, but a lot of questions coming in. Before that, Eleanor, I'm going to put you on the spot. Who are the brands you admire the most when it comes to sustainability communications? Obviously, Priya is already there from Unilever. You don't need to mention Unilever. Anybody else that you look at and you say, they're really nailing it?
Well, of course, I mean, I do have to say Unilever is in a league of its own. Even that it set up its strategy in 2010 is just, I mean, it is jaw-dropping to think that they've been at this game so long. So I mean, I would have said Unilever, but seeing as I'm not allowed, I'll move on. I think, again, I don't, communications are only valuable when they're backed up by action. And so then actually the question you're asking me is, which companies do I think are doing a really good job? So I think, I actually think Microsoft is pretty outstanding in what it does in terms of climate and sustainability. It has a commitment to be net negative by 2040, I think, which is pretty sort of revolutionary. I think there are companies like Google, I think, has done some innovations that have actually changed the sort of game. I don't know if you've looked for a flight recently on Google, but you can now, the findings are ranked in terms of carbon emissions, which is a sort of small step that actually really can have a massive impact. So I suppose I'm particularly keen on tech companies, but I mean, there are, of course, other brilliant organizations doing incredible work too.
So on a move to the audience questions now. Thank you for that very much, Eleanor. Priya, let me ask you this one because it's an interesting one for you. I remember my former company was doing this a lot, but how important is ESG for your investors? And
yeah, well, ESG, obviously, it's extremely important because we're a business. We've got shareholders, and driving growth is extremely important. And what we've following the USLP, which is the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which was from 2010 to 20, we've now introduced what we call the Compass. And one of our key objectives out there is to actually show that our new model, or our model, which is really based on sustainability, is really going to be a driver for growth for us. So, and that is also actually one of the key reasons as to why any company needs to look at sustainability. Yeah, is it you need to look at what are the costs, like Angus has mentioned, what are the costs, what are the risks, and what is the growth that you're really looking for? Because those are the things that sustainability can really help drive. So, we don't see any difference between driving our sustainability ambition and ensuring the growth of our brands. And Angus had brought out a very good point, which is about what we are calling a little bit the commercialization of sustainability. So how do we really ensure that all the investments and resources that we are putting in to ensure that our brands, our operations are becoming sustainable is something that we can offer to our consumers in the form of a final product at a great price, which drives both product efficiency and are sustainable. Yeah, from a packaging, product, ingredient perspective, end of consumer life perspective. So growth and sustainability really go hand in hand. And for us, it's really one is going to help drive the other. Eleanor has a point.
There was a very interesting article in Bloomberg.
thank you.
Just a few days ago.
Eleanor.
Oh, sorry. So there was a very interesting article about sort of the value of ESG investing, which really, on a sort of number of different measures, we're not necessarily sure. I think that ESG investing, brings a financial return, or at least in terms of the study that McKinsey led. But they did find that it had a very important impact on the social license to operate of companies. And I think that is something that we need to discuss and talk about too. For Unilever, of course, which has a really strong one in the first place, it's maybe a bit less relevant. But for other companies, and perhaps some people on the call, who are in organizations that are just starting on the journey, I think we need to be aware that, getting involved in having a sustainability strategy at some point will be essential for your, social license.
Thank you, Eleanor. I've got a question for you, Angus. This is arguing that a broad ESG approach should be dumped in favor of a more rigorous focus on emissions.
Well, emissions are only part of it, as I mentioned earlier. It's the whole chain from where are you getting your raw materials, how are they gotten, how are they then delivered, and then what you do with them, which includes emissions, packaging, whatever. And then, for some companies, and then what happens further on when the customer gets it. It's not that simple. But for startups, say with fintech companies and others, look at your energy emissions and take charge of them at the very beginning, for example. And I think encouraging those who are starting businesses to say it has to be a core part of your principles are important. The very large companies get it, but it's the speed of change. And as somebody who's been in the markets a very long time, I was quite lucky to have studied some earth and environmental science when I was at university, because it's given me at least some moral as well as intellectual background in terms of geology and weather systems and everything else. So I get a lot of what's happening with weather, and I'm very concerned. But Eleanor used a very important word earlier, optimistic. It's very easy for everyone to say, oh, it's the end. Things will change, and they may not be easy for people looking ahead, given the changes we've seen on a 1% degree. And this region, the MENA region's already seen, Middle East, North Africa, it's already 2 degrees up in a century, centigrade. But we have to move with greater speed. And it's working in a multi-layered approach. As I've said already, it's whatever fits with that company and what it does. If we're sitting in an office all day, our emissions are going to be quite identifiable. The other issue, though, again, Eleanor raised this, is about travel. We travel to work, many of us, and sometimes I used to do 35 kilometers, and that's emissions that I have to take account of going back and forth to London, incredible amount of CO2 emissions. So the fact that what do I do as an individual? I can't just leave it to British Airways or whoever else that's flying me. It's saying, what do I do about it? Whether it's giving capital to the Woodland Trust or something, or do I really have to travel? The fact that we were organizing this event, thank goodness, online, even though there's wonderful benefits of meeting people, the fact is we have to do this. One of the significant lessons of COVID that is definitely staying with us, thank goodness, is the fact that we can do this and get the message across. So I've been looking at some of the questions that people are mentioning about emissions. It's not easy. More and more people are engaged in what we call this ESG. But in the end, it's becoming more identifiable because companies know what they need to do, but they're under pressure from some shareholders not to do very much because they want the return. So, as I said, to use an earlier phrase, we have battles ahead. We know what the end goal should be, but those battles may not always be easy or short-term won, but we want to win the war. But that war ending, a bit like Russia into Ukraine, has to be sooner rather than later. So I think that's a roundabout way of trying to supply your answer, Alex, an answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Angus. I'm going to Q&A because we've got a lot of questions coming in. Really, really interesting. Eleanor, a really fascinating question asked with the UK's net zero commitments. I'm not going to ask you that, but what I am going to ask you is to sustainability when we have a change in leadership. Is that a threat to how organizations tackle sustainability? And should it be a threat?
I think what the encouraging thing, I think you have to remain optimistic when you work in climate and sustainability, because otherwise you won't get out of bed in the morning. But so forgive the relentless optimism, but I think what we have seen is that the private sector has stepped up. And I very much hope that that will insulate us against the sort of vagaries of policy of any new leader. Yeah, I think I think we saw that in, when Trump was president, with California and Gavin Newsom setting up. California is, I think, the 5th largest economy in the world. They continued to sort of adhere to sort of emissions targets for vehicles. That meant actually that they sort of set the standard for car companies, which embraced them to their credit. So yes, I think politics plays a huge role. But as I say, we're stuck in the short-termist of a political cycle, an election cycle. But when we have those who don't perhaps see the need for climate action as very urgent, perhaps that short-termism is more of a bonus.
Thank you, Eleanor. Priya, I've got a great question for you. Lucia asks, other than packaging changes, which are very popular, what are some of the less obvious examples of changes companies are making to become more sustainable? Obviously, for me, the P&G example is the washing machine, setting it to 40 rather than a high temperature. So tell us a little bit about some of the less obvious changes that Unilever has made.
So there's a lot of work that we are doing from our foods, from the perspective of our foods brands. So, you know, in our part of the world, obesity is a rising problem out here, and it's primarily on account of, you know, a lot of change in eating habits. A lot of more processed foods are being eaten, and so on and so forth. So we have a big commitment to bring down what we call ingredients of concern, which are related to salt, sugar, trans fats. So a lot of product reformulation is being done. We also tend to do a lot of work through our foods brands on getting people moving. Yeah, so encouraging lifestyle changes, which is to you know, really get people to go to the gyms and move around, not easy in environments like, you know, the UAE. So that's a lot related to our foods brand. And our food brands are now also working on coming up with alternate foods and ensuring that we are offering a lot more nutritious foods to consumers. With regards to our beauty and personal care division, there's you know, obviously everybody's pretty aware of the work that Dove tends to do on self-esteem, but a lot more of our brands are actually taking on to drive increased, you know, beauty confidence, beauty awareness and confidence amongst consumers. So it's a lot of issues or consciousness with regards to beauty, especially in this part of the world, is to do with outer beauty, but you've really got to explain to you know, youngsters as to what real beauty, or what, you know, the levels of confidence and where they need to come from. And that's a lot of work that our brands are doing. Then on the social front, we tend to do a lot of work. In Egypt, our business has done some amazing work with regards to providing job opportunities to people of you know, from the lower segment, and also youth who are very well educated. This is a big problem in Egypt, for instance, where you have young men who are well educated but don't have access to jobs. So how do we actually provide them with jobs that are within our value chain, may not be directly related to us? So there's a lot of work that we do. And then, of course, as related to human rights principles, we try and ensure that all of our suppliers across our value chain are aligned to things like basic wage and basic work. Our suppliers are also aligned, you know, to basic human rights principles. And there's a lot of work that we do in that area. So I'm hoping that helps answer beyond our basic climate-related agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Priya. Angus, I'm going to switch back to you with a really interesting question from Edelman. Given increasing regulatory demands, including external auditing and financial equivalency on sustainability reporting, how important is the relationship between finance, IR, and also sustainability with the communications function going to be?
Look at the question. Everything is interrelated. We make the assumption everyone just works in silos, and to agree, some people do. But I think the reporting, I'm just saying about the reporting and the relationship. First of all, with the large companies, it's perhaps easier because you've got so many people who can take part in that discussion and say, I'll take somebody here from distribution, somebody else here from whatever, different divisions. You bring them together to form a group, a committee, to try to ensure that the message is getting out, or that action is, first of all, action has been taken, and then the message is getting out. So it's the whole chain of from, I mentioned earlier, from you setting the strategy, the plan, the strategy, working through to actions. And I think that, first of all, if a company is working smoothly, and I've worked in organizations which have been both smooth and not smooth in terms of engaging across different divisions, then I think that that calls for whoever's in charge to say, okay, what can we do to ensure that those goals are being met, and making sure that everyone in each of those silos are playing their part to make sure that it's a 3D effort, if that makes sense, and answering the question, because I can't see the question anymore.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I'm going to shift now to Eleanor with one.
I love this. I love the sound in your background, by the way.
Question.
Ooh, Alex, I lost you.
Yeah, it's remote working. Metrics keep coming up. And James asked a question. And can you hear me now, guys?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Tell you what, I am gonna. Okay, good. So the question of metrics keeps coming up. The issue of standardized metrics. Is metrics, are metrics on the issue going to be standardized? Are we going to see a set of metrics which everybody shares? Obviously, we have the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, but is this going to happen? And if it does happen, how is it going to make it easier in terms of reporting on the issue?
If I can jump in there, I mean, I think metrics are absolutely essential. And you know, the boring bit, you know, it's the data really.
Sorry, I was going to say in terms of report.
Oh, in terms of reporting metrics, yeah, metrics are really important, and I think there's a lot of frustration, which I think is understandable from companies, because the playing field isn't level, and you know, people will find, I've talked to clients who will find that, you know, their competitors are making vast claims based on data that actually, you know, very clearly doesn't stack up. So I think that's something that'll have to happen. And I think there are moves to try and have, you know, standardized taxonomies across, you know, across various regions. But it'll come with time. I think, you know, the frustration, the imperative is that we need to act, and we need to act urgently because of the state of the climate, which means that there isn't perfect, but we cannot wait until we have perfect data. Like, we have to work with what we've got now, and then we can fix it later. We can fix how we report on things, but everybody still needs to do the best that they absolutely can, and they need to stretch themselves to know what that best actually is. But I think that we'll be seeing developments in data and metrics and reporting in the next few years, but, you know, don't hang around waiting for them.
Thank you, Eleanor. I hope my internet is a little bit better now. I'm going to ask the last question to Priya, the issue of greenwashing. Priya, what do you see from consumers in terms of how they make choices and how they treat companies which make greenwashing claims?
So thanks, Alex. Greenwashing is becoming, I think this also goes back to the previous question regarding claims, right? Is there any global approved standard on claims, especially with regards to environment and everything? And my understanding is that something is in the process of being developed, but in the absence of that, you know, when claims which are outrageous or are not substantiated or backed up by action, they have they obviously have a big reputational impact on the brand if they tend to get caught out. And there is a question I did see out there where somebody asked, what happens if you do get caught out when you're making greenwashing claims? You know, out there, I just tell them I'd step back into my crisis and issues mode, which is to be, you know, be transparent about it. If you know, if you have made a claim, and a lot of times companies make claims not because they are trying to do the wrong thing, it's just that they don't know any better. Yeah. So it's very important that when you're trying to make a claim, please backtrack, ensure that your teams are clear about what they are stating, because it's a misrepresentation merely in the submission. Yeah. So they might be trying to say the correct thing. So I'll try and explain what I mean. For instance, when we are changing our packaging and we are making it recyclable, because people have to understand, consumers must understand that our packaging is not automatically recyclable. There's a lot of R&D work that we need to do at the back end to try and make it monomaterial and ensure, therefore, it's recyclable. We cannot just call it recyclable. We cannot just put on the pack and say this is recyclable, because at the end of the day, you need the infrastructure to be able to recycle it. Yeah. So that's a little bit of what I was trying to explain, is that a lot of times when companies claim things, it's not because they're trying to be disingenuous, it's just because they don't know any better. So it's very important that when you are making claims like this, go back and try and look at it from a 360-degree perspective and try and ensure that your claim is then backed up by the relevant action and measurement, so that if you are called out at any point of time, you can substantiate that claim. So that's one. But when it is actually disingenuous, so there have been, especially the oil companies, when they have, they've not been doing the right things, and they're coming and they have come up with these amazing ads, yeah, to try and deflect opinion. In that case, what ends up happening is consumers tend to get very put off. So there are almost about, I think, 50% of consumers in America right now don't really believe in claims, sustainability claims that companies are making. And while I don't have the data for the Middle East, because we don't have a lot of research, even me as a consumer, if I walk into a store and I keep seeing the word organic, believe me, I'm not very convinced at the end of the day. So it's not very good for the work that companies are really trying to do on the sustainability front, because at the end of the day, the consumers are getting they're really getting put off. So it's very important that when companies start claiming, they look at it from a 360-degree and ensure that their communication is trying to communicate information that they can actually back up.
And so can I just jump in there too? I mean, there is the rather like landmark.
Thank you very much, Priya. Sorry, Eleanor, go for it.
Sorry, I'll just say quickly, but I mean, if that's the carrot, the stick is that the UK government has just opened an investigation into 3 fast fashion brands investigating their claims of sustainability. So, at the moment, it might be reputation at risk, but further down the line, you could face, regulatory fines and etc.
A good place to end. The thought of reputation, and also what else can happen in terms of greenwashing, because it is an issue that everybody cares about: sustainability, environment, etc. It matters to all of us. So I want to say a big thank you to our panelists: Angus Blair, the CEO of Signet Institute; Eleanor O'Keefe, Senior Director of Corporate Sustainability EMEA at Edelman; and also Priya, Sarma, Sustainability for Unilever in the Middle East. You've been an exceptional panel. We've had a lot of questions, and I'm sure we're going to be talking much more about this issue in terms of how it impacts communications and our organizations. So thank you very much. And Liam, over to you.
Hiya, thanks for joining everyone today. Hope you enjoyed that. We've kept a note of some of the questions that didn't get answered, so hopefully we'll be able to share some of those when the answers to those when the event recording is also shared. But yeah, just thanks for coming today. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you.